Good morning. It is so good to be with you this morning. If you are visiting with us, we are glad that you're here. I'd love for you to grab a Bible and open up to 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7. If you're visiting with us, we've been in a series for a few weeks now called Prophets, Priests, and Kings, where we periodically go through, especially the Old Testament, and look through the way God utilized prophets and priests and kings, and the way that the timeline of God and the way that ultimately the Messiah would come about. God utilized these individual types of folks all throughout the Old Testament to accomplish his purpose. And we've been studying the man Samuel, looking through 1 Samuel recently. I want to give you a little bit of a encouragement, not regarding Samuel, but next week. We've been referencing it for a few weeks now, but next Saturday we've got Digital Parenting Workshop. This is done by Chad Landman. He's one of the ministers at Graymere Church of Christ in Columbia, Tennessee. If you've never been to this, it is fantastic. It is so informative. This is the world we live in, especially if you've got young people that you love, whether it's kids, cousins, kids at school. This is showing us how to be better leaders and role models and examples in a digital world. And then on top of that, he's doing that Saturday, but then Sunday, he's going to be here preaching for us Sunday morning and Sunday night. And so I want to encourage you, definitely be here for that. Chad's a fantastic speaker. I've known him for a long time, even back until when he was working and interning up in Kentucky. We did camp together at Rolling Hills and got some good stories there. But Chad is a fantastic minister. I want to encourage you to be here next week for that. But this morning, the title of our lesson, if you get the bulletin, you saw this, is called The Warning of a King. And we've been kind of building up to this for a few weeks, even really dating back. If you were here for our VBS in the adult class, we talked about the profiles of good kings and bad kings, and warning of God saying, listen, I know you want a king. For hundreds of years, they've been asking for this. And God's continually warned them against what was coming. And 1 Samuel 7 and verse 15, we look kind of at the profile of Samuel. We started looking at Hannah, his mom, and then we see Eli, who was one of the high priests and working with Samuel. Then Samuel ultimately was kind of was away for a few chapters, supposedly. We don't have record of him in kind of the middle section here. But then about chapter 6 and 7, he comes back on the scene. Remember, they tried to go out and fight the Philistines. Israel lost. They thought, well, let's take the Ark of the Covenant out. A terrible idea. The Philistines got it, but then they started getting all kinds of bad things happening. They sent the Ark back. And ultimately, Eli and his sons have died. They would have been the next in line to kind of lead Israel. And so then we see Samuel kind of take over on the scene. And chapter 7 and verse 15 says, Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. And what we're going to do this morning is I'd like for us to kind of look at two kind of parallel topics, because we see the life of Samuel. And what I really want us to emphasize is some of the amazing characteristics that Samuel exemplified leading during a really difficult time. This was a hard time to lead God's people. Because remember, he's kind of right in the middle of what we call the judges and the time of the kings. In fact, he was the last judge. For 200 years, God's people had asked for a king, and God would send them a judge to handle things in the interim. But then ultimately, things are going to come to a head in our lesson today. And so from really 1 Samuel 8 onward, Samuel doesn't really die until later on, about chapter 24, 25. But his significance diminishes greatly because they're ultimately going to appoint a king. And here very soon, we're going to see the installment of King Saul. And then ultimately, that's going to lead us into what we know as the era of the kings or the monarchs, because it's going to be King Saul, which is going to lead to David, and then Solomon, and then we see Israel divide. And we have what we call the divided kingdom. And we have Israel, and then we have Judah. And we're going to look at how awful of a multi-hundred-year span, because this is really going to take us through the remainder, a lot of the Old Testament. And so we're going to look at all of this, but Samuel's this intermediary here. I want us to pay attention to where we're at in Scripture, because I'm fearful sometimes we know a lot of Bible stories, but we forget the story of the Bible. right? We know individual little things, but where does it go in the greater continuity of it all? So if you look, Genesis, Exodus, we start in the creation account. Then we see God's people that are going to ultimately have an exodus out of Egypt, right? They've been taken into captivity. God's going to ultimately take them out. Moses, you know that phrase, let my people go, talking to Pharaoh, getting them out. And that's going to take us into the wilderness, and God's going to ultimately establish what it's going to mean to be God's people for a time. Then we're going to see them enter into the promised land, and we're going to see Joshua take over from Moses. And then we're going to kind of enter into really the period of the judges. Now they're going to continually ask for a king, and God's going to say no. In his infinite wisdom, he knows what's going to come. And as we're going to look this morning, you're going to see this one decision of kind of forcing God's hand, so to speak, to give a king is going to lead to millennia after millennia of really poor prosperity on Israel's part, because they picked men that didn't follow God. And God told them exactly what would happen if they did that. But they kept pushing and pushing, and so God gave them judges. And if you remember guys like Gideon and Samson and Deborah, and then we're going to end with Samuel. Samuel's the last of these, and he kind of came and judged Israel. But ultimately, Samuel in our study today is going to get old. And his sons aren't a whole lot better than Eli's sons were. And so ultimately the people are going to come and say, well, Samuel, you're old now. Your time of service is coming to an end. We think it's time for a king. And we're going to see the way God interacts with this. So let's read 16 and 17 together, because this is going to start our story, and then we're going to transition over into chapter 8, which is where we're going to actually see some of this transition happening. But I want you to notice, because again, we go back, 15 tells us that Samuel served Israel all the days of his life. So we only have a few verses, but recognize that these few verses are essentially the account of Samuel's adult life as it pertains to serving God's people. Because we've already seen his birth. We see him as a teenager coming up under Eli. He's missing for a few chapters, and what that really just means is he's in the background, right? Eli's in charge, and so God's kind of preparing Samuel in the background. Now Eli dies. He's in his 20s, and he's now taking over. And what's amazing about this is that the writer felt sufficient, inspiredly sufficient to write simply, Samuel continued as his leader all the days of his life. And we get into 16 and 17, and I want you to see what that amounts to. Because I think there are some lessons that we can pull out of this. Because in essence, Samuel is a fantastic leader. But he doesn't have the pomp and the circumstance and the big military victories that David's going to have, right? He's not going to rebuild the temple like Solomon will. He's not going to have some of these kind of things. Samuel is the quintessential profile of what it means to show up, to be faithful day in and day out. And that gets summed up by saying, all the days of Samuel's life, he served God and he served Israel. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all these places. But he always went back home to Ramah, where his home was. And there also he held court for Israel and built an altar there to the Lord. I want you to imagine with me briefly, because again, this is about all that we know of all of the years from the time Samuel's in his 20s until we believe he was in his upper 80s when he's going to ultimately start, Israel's going to push back for a king in chapter 8 and verse 1. So we're talking about approximately 50, 60 years of time that gets summed up by like 3 verses. He serves Israel all the days of his life, and then this little circuit gets described. And if you look at a map, if your Bible has a map, or if you want to look up a map of Israel around the time of Samuel, you'll notice that Gilgal, Mizpah, and Bethel and Ramah are all about a couple miles from each other. They make this little square almost. And you can imagine, because Scripture, the ESV at least, translates it a circuit. And it's this idea that Samuel, day in and day out, woke up and he went to Bethel. Then he went to Gilgal. Then he went to Mizpah. Then he came back to Ramah. And then he did it again and again and again and again. And we think about this idea of serving in the repetition. And sometimes, we want the new and big and exciting thing. But part of Christianity is trusting in that routine that God places us and being faithful when new, big, exciting things aren't happening. Because that's Samuel's life. That's Samuel's story, is being faithful to God when it wasn't exciting, when war wasn't going on, but he was leading and he was guiding and he was directing God's people. And I want us to look at this profile of Samuel and take a page out of this playbook, because many times this is going to be at least the bulk of our life. Right, when we become a Christian, we start out in kind of the early days, and it's exciting, right? We come to know Christ, and wherever that happened, and we're on fire, and we're ready to go. But there's going to come a transition point where some of that fire fades slightly, and we get into kind of the day in, day out of what does it mean to be a Christian, and all the while, we may be, getting married and having kids and having a career. And I thought about this, and the only thing that kept coming to my mind, and maybe it's because I'm in the throes of it at the moment, but this kind of routine sounds a lot like parenting, right? This routine of, if you want to come hear about our day, we can tell you about Monday, and that's the same as Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and by and large, except on the margins, it's this repetition of the structure of life that our kids have come to know and need, and your kids did too. And we have certain books in our toy room that are about to fall apart because they keep handing us over and over and over. It's this repetition, but this is part of the way God designed the family, is that children work within structure in this routine that we as parents offer to our children that help guide them into growing up and being adults, right? Some of this structure is what they need to flourish, and that's what Samuel was offering to Israel. I read it, we look in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 1, and when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. But the problem, we'll look in a few verses, is Samuel's sons weren't a whole lot better than Eli's sons. They were greedy, they took bribes, they are not in a position to lead Israel the way that they should, right? And we keep looking through this. One of Samuel's greatest qualities was the faithfulness to the role that God had given him. We talked some this morning in our class about faithfulness and being faithful in prayer and the way the Spirit interacts with us. Samuel, I'm going to suggest, is kind of the poster child for this faithfulness during the day in and day out grind of life. David had some of the extreme highs, Solomon did, and then we're going to look in the divided kingdom, and we're going to see some of the there's not many of them, but some of the great kings had these great triumphs. Some of the really bad kings had these terrible failures. Samuel is a leader that's kind of neither of those. He is perfectly in the middle, and that's the way many of our lives are going to be as a Christian. Right, is we're going to have a few of the victories, we're going to have a few of the failures, but most of our life is going to be spent in the middle. And we have to figure out a way to continually pursue faithfulness in that middle. The way I read it was at the core of faithfulness, and I love this phrase, I had never considered it before, but is a holy redundancy. The idea of holiness is just being set apart for something special. Right? And so the idea of faithfulness is being set apart, that redundancy, that routine, that pattern, that repetition, that holy repetition that our life can be is what Samuel was exemplifying, where we try to bring our best self to the table day in and day out. Faithfulness is what Samuel exemplified better than any, and what I want us to continually look at. Let's go to 1 Samuel and let's reread 1 and go down to verse 5. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together. Now, when you read this, I want you to hear, this is not leadership rising above Israel. The structure of the Jewish societal system was that the elders spoke for the people that they were over. So when it says that the elders came and confronted Samuel, in essence, what that's saying is all of Israel is confronting Samuel. because the elders are going to speak for the people, right? So the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, because remember that's his home. They said to him, "You're old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us." And notice this, what's their reasoning? "Such as all the other nations have done." We look at this idea, and it's not necessarily that God was totally opposed to the idea of a king. What God was opposed to, and what we're going to look at, God talked about this. This is not a new idea. We'll look back in Deuteronomy 17. God told them that a king was going to come. Right? It's not that God necessarily was anti-king. It was that God was anti a king for the reasons that they wanted it. Right? If they'd have come to God and said, "Lord, if you will appoint us a leader, you are still our ultimate king, but we need leadership on the ground," God was going to say, "Fantastic. We can work with that system." But if you want a king to be like everybody else, if you want a king to fit in, if you want a king to go out and fight your battles for you, and you want a king to worship on this side of eternity, I'm not okay with it. But this is what Israel continually pointed to. Let's read together Deuteronomy 17. If you go back to your Old Testament and find Deuteronomy chapter 17, again, we recognize starting in verse 14, God has told Israel about kings before. This is not new information. And in fact, my Bible has the subheading in Deuteronomy 17, starting in 14, and we'll read down through the end of the chapter, "Laws concerning Israel's king." Listen to this. "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me.'" Does this sound familiar? This is God preemptively telling Israel what's coming. "You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt and to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, 'You shall never return that way again.' And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excess silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by keeping all the words of the law and their statutes and doing them. And his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and he may not turn aside from the commandment, either the right or the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel." So God has laid out and told them ahead of time, "I know what's coming. But the reasons have to be right. For this to work, and for this to be a good thing, the reasons have to be aligned with my will." And we see from the very get-go that they're not. We look at the very end of this again. "Lord, we want a king. Samuel, you're old. Your sons aren't like you were. We want a king because that's what everybody else has." And so I want to spend the rest of our time looking at two things, because again, I think we see two reasons why the way they presented a king was counterintuitive to what God's plan was and what God wanted. And I think we can take things away. And then I want to look at the profile of Samuel, because again, this is a transition point where we don't read as much about Samuel from chapter 8 on, because they're about to appoint Saul. Saul has become the focus of the latter portion of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and then we enter into 1 and 2 Kings, and we're squarely in the monarch era. So before we move on from Samuel, I don't want us to forget who Samuel is and what he does that makes him such a faithful servant. And you and I would be good to follow in those guidelines. You know, we look, and in chapter 8, 10 through 18, we look and it tells us to a degree some of 1 Samuel, we see some of what's going to come if you lay out a king, right? Samuel's going to tell them ahead of time, listen, if you want to put a king, if you demand a king, my Bible has a subheading, Samuel's warning against kings. We won't read all this, the 8 verses for the sake of time, but he says that king will set for himself and be on the throne, and he's going to take your sons to be as warriors and to fight. He's going to take your daughters and make them servants. He's going to take 1/10 of all of your crop and your flocks. He's going to take your servants to be his servants, and you're ultimately going to be his slaves. Samuel's warning them and saying, this is what will come. He says, you're going to cry out for help, but you chose him, and so the Lord's not going to help you. You're choosing an earthly king over a heavenly king. He says, if you're in trouble, God's not going to be there to bail you out. Let's read 19 through 22. But the people, because this is right on the heels, remember 10 through 18 is Samuel warning them of all these things. Going to take your sons, your daughters, your servants, you're going to be slaves. And they hear all this and listen to their response. 19, the very next verse. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all that the people said. He repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. And Samuel said to the Israelites, everyone go back to your own town. I want us to look at the motivation for why they wanted a king. And I think we see two things. Because this is going to lead us into the period of King Saul, which is going to lead us into David, which is going to lead us into Solomon. They aren't perfect, but they at least as a whole follow after God by and large. But then after Solomon, we're going to have what's the divided kingdom. And I know you can't read this, but I want you to just look at the colors. On the left side, you're going to see the kingdoms of Judah. And the green are the few good kings. On the right is all of Israel's kings. Every one of them is bad. Not just a little bit bad, but corrupt and evil, turning to other gods, sacrificing children, intermarrying with other nations. So this one question, this one thing that they're posing to Samuel, give us a king, is going to lead to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of suffering. From Saul to David to Solomon, and then this chart represents about 400 or 500 years by itself of the divided kingdoms, and you see a lot more red than you see green. Because some of the good kings that are technically green were only king for a few years because Israel was so counter to what God would want that when a good king finally did get appointed and began to right the ship, they would run him off or kill him. So some of these kings weren't even kings for very long because they served God. Samuel is right at the transition point. But we might look at this and say, if God was okay with bringing a king in the past, Deuteronomy is talking about what's coming. Why is he unhappy with Israel now? Right? Why is he unhappy with the way that they're bringing about it? Because he's already talked about a king in Deuteronomy, and Leviticus has some of this too. It's not just Deuteronomy. And I want to look at two reasons why this is the case. God is upset because Israel has rejected God as their ultimate high king. God's not necessarily upset with them wanting an earthly leader. Right? That's been around for a long time, but it's with the understanding that God is king. God is Lord. God is the one to be worshiped. A leader is simply somebody that's going to be the hands and feet of God on this side of eternity. And Israel is obviously not getting this. First of which, this rejects God as king because their true desire is to be like all the other nations. It rejects God as king because Israel's saying, Lord, we want a king, not because we need a great leader, not because we want to be closer to you, not because any of this. We want to be like all these other nations. We want to be like the Moabites and the Amorites and the Amalekites. We want to be like all these guys that worship Baal and worship all these other idols. Leviticus 20 and verse 26 says, you shall be holy to me, for I am the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the people that you should be mine. Friends, that imperative has not changed. God expects us as Christians. Christ said that I am in the world, but I'm not of the world. Right? We have to live out in the world. That's part of how we evangelize. It's how we teach and preach. But you and I have to be different. We have to be the city set on the hill. We have to be the salt. We have to be the light. And we have to serve the one true living God. This rejected God's plan because they wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted to be in the world and of the world. They wanted to be like everybody else. It also rejects God's plan because they had an idolatrous trust in human salvation, in human deliverance, in mankind's ability to get them out of a jam and to lead them into prosperity. They trusted this as an idol. And another way we could phrase all of this is they wanted to trust in ourselves, and they wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted to fit in. They wanted the Moabites. They wanted the Edomites. They wanted all these other nations to think that we're part of the group, and we want to trust in our ability to get things done. Does that sound like any other country and nation and world that we live in? Does this sound like anything else we're familiar with? Guys, this is not dissimilar from the world we live in. We want to fit in, and we want to trust in ourselves. And God says, if you want to do that, don't come to me when things go awry. I am the one true living God. Which leads us as we round kind of home plate. How do we be a Samuel? Samuel has warned them over and over and over. And again, he is a grinder in the day-to-day, the holy redundancy, the holy pattern and routine of guiding and being faithful. How do we be that way? I've got a couple suggestions. One, a faithful servant perseveres. To be a Samuel, to be a Samuel-like leader, to have Samuel-level faithfulness, it requires perseverance. Look in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 35. It says, be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their masters to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress him to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. Friends, we don't know when the master's going to come, but the master will come, and he's going to take account of are we ready? Are we sleeping? Are we watching? Are we ready? Are we dressed, ready to go and be of use to the master? Samuel's life, in a word, was perseverance. It was faithfulness. Again, we think about Gilgal to Mizpah to Ramah, back around. It's this cycle, it's this routine of leadership that very much parallels our life as Christians today. A faithful servant serves where they're needed. This was not a perfect role by any means. You know, Samuel's in the throes of Israel, constantly wanting a king. They had just got destroyed by the Philistines because chiefly they've been away from God. Samuel had a tough assignment. It would have been way easier for him to just say, God, I got to leave. I got to go somewhere else. This is too tough. This is tough sledding, and I don't want any part of this. But we see Samuel serve and prosper where he's planted. God needed a faithful leader. God needed Samuel where Samuel was. Very few leaders would have been able to endure and provide the strength that Samuel did and not require any of the celebration, the pomp and circumstance. God needed him there. And this echoes very much our life. You know, I think of in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You know, Paul is talking about how to serve different people. And I think about this idea of prospering where you're planted, right? Where you are right now. Maybe at work, maybe at school, maybe at home. You know, there are times where we want to throw in the towel and say, God, this is too tough, right? Nobody here at work, nobody at school believes what I believe. It would be easier to do this somewhere else or bring somebody else in. But listen to the way Paul describes this. He says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though myself I am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. So as to win those not having the law, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. What Paul is saying is, you have an opportunity where you are to win souls for Christ. He's saying, if I'm with the Jews, then I'm going to connect with them on that way. If I'm with the Gentiles, I'm going to connect with them that way. What that means for us is when I'm at work with those kind of people, I'm going to connect. I'm going to be the light, but I'm going to find ways to connect with them, to share the gospel with them. If I'm at home, I'm going to do it at home. If I'm at school, I'm going to do it at school. And I've got the message to share, and I'm going to find ways to connect. I'm going to prosper, and I'm going to flourish where I'm planted. A faithful servant yields to God's will and plan. A faithful servant, to be a Samuel, it requires perseverance. It requires a willingness to serve where you are, and it requires a willingness to yield to God's will and to God's plan. I think of 1 Chronicles 28. This is David, and David had these grand ambitions to plan and to rebuild the temple, right? This was kind of post God had forgiven him of a lot of what he had done. He said, Lord, you deserve a permanent house. You deserve the grandest of temples. And he had rebuilt, he had plans for it all. But of course, God tells him, no, David, it's not you that's going to do this, it's your son. But this had been something that David had been dreaming about and planning about and putting time and money into. But listen to the words that he told Solomon in 1 Chronicles 28. He says, "And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every desire and every thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house as a sanctuary. Be strong and do the work." Friends, David understood that sometimes we yield to God's plan, that we flourish where we're planted, and there are times where God desires for us to go places that we may not want to go, to talk and evangelize with people that we may not want to evangelize. But we're called as Christians to serve those. That's our idea of being sent out, our theme this year, therefore go. Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission to go into all the reaches of the world. Are we faithful? Will we persevere? Will we flourish where we're planted? Samuel had a tremendous life of grinding through the middle, something that I think many of us can empathize with. That faithful showing up day in and day out to serve God. That is the mark of a faithful Christian, a mark of a faithful servant of God that I hope that we will challenge ourselves to be more like. If you're not a Christian today, we want to give you that opportunity that you can put on Christ in baptism. But maybe you just need prayers or support. We'd love to help you with that as well. If we can do anything for you,